So how can I tell when I'm ready? Okay, 45. Okay, wow. Thank you for joining us for our panel on renewable energy and indigenous communities. I'm here from the Kleinman Center. I'm Angela Pachon, the research director. And this event is part of Energy Week, a full week of energy-focused events across Penn campus. Before I introduce our guest today, I want to first mention that we are pleased to have a Spanish translator for this event. So as you enter, you were invited to select a language. If you miss that or wish to change the selection, please leave the meeting and re-enter. And now in Spanish, este evento está traducido al español. Si usted quiere escucharlo en español y no se dio cuenta de la opción al entrar a esta reunión, por favor salga y vuelva a entrar y seleccione la opción. So now in English again, this panel is being recorded and the recording and slides will be available on our website tomorrow. Please use the Q&A to submit your questions. I encourage you to submit them along the way so we can organize and combine them and we can cover more ground at the end. So I want to now welcome our speakers, and we have an amazing lineup of panelists all around the world. We are going to have from Canada, Melina Labucan Massimo. Melina is an international renowned advocate for climate justice, indigenous sovereignty, and women's rights. Melina is Lubicon Cree from Northern Alberta, Canada. She's the founder of Sacred Earth Solar, co-founder and Just Transition Director at the Indigenous Climate Action, and a climate fellow at the David Suzuki Foundation. She is the host of a new TV series called Power to the People, which profiles renewable energy in indigenous communities. Melina holds a master's degree in indigenous governance at the University of Victoria with a focus on renewable energy. She is also a 2021-2022 Kleinman Center visiting scholar. I'm also, we're having here from Australia, Gunnar Maynard. Gunnar is a Kamilaroi man from central New South Wales, but he grew up on Australia's eastern coast near the land of the Wurundjeri people. He has worked as a lawyer and a researcher in a variety of fields of concern to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including native title, environmental and planning law, and indigenous incarceration. Gunnar has a BA and an LLB from the University of South Wales in Australia. And I don't think she has joined. She may be late, hopefully, but we are having also from Mexico, Lucila Bettina Cruz Velasquez. Lucila is a Beniza woman from Yucatan, Oaxaca in Mexico. She is a Mexican human rights defender and member of the Assembly of the Indigenous Peoples of the Tehuantepec Isthmus in defense of land and territory in Oaxaca. She's also a member of the movement of civil resistance against high electricity prices, and she is an agricultural engineer from the UNAM with a Master of Rural Development from the Universidad Autónoma of Chapingo, and she also has doctoral studies from the Universidad de Barcelona. So let's hope, but oh, Bettina is here. So that's great. Bettina has just joined, so she will be also part of this panel. And finally, we have moderating this event here from Penn, Professor Tulia Faletti. Tulia will be our moderator, and she's the class of 1965 endowed term professor of political science. She's the director of the Latin American and Latinx Studies program at Penn, and a senior fellow of the Leonard Davis Institution for Health Economics. So now I'll turn time over to Tulia, and let's get started.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Angela, for the introductions. Thank you to everyone who has come to this terrific panel to learn more about renewable energy and indigenous communities. These are two themes that are often together, but today I think we'll be seeing the complex ways in which they are interlinked. So it's today my pleasure to give the floor to our three speakers. We will start with Melina Labucan-Massino. Melina, feel free to get us started, please.
Thank you, Tulia. Tansegwakia, Nia Melina Miawapan Labucan-Massino, Nia Nihiao, Kinaskuntanawao. That is my language for introducing myself. My name is Melina Labucan-Massimo. I come from, in our language, we say Nihiao, and it's also known as Cree, the Cree Nation, where I was born in my community called Little Buffalo, Alberta. And I'm going to be showing photos today because I feel like that's an easier way to explain kind of the complexities that we're going to be discussing a bit here today around Indigenous communities, renewable energy, and how, for me, as well as how it's connected to resource extraction and extractivism. So I'm going to switch over to a PowerPoint here, so please excuse the momentary delay. And please let me know if there's any issues in viewing this slide. I'm going to pull it on full preview, view, where was it? I just figured it out, and then here we go, enter full screen. So please let me know if you can't see it otherwise, but I'm so happy to be here today with the University of Pennsylvania, as well as the Kleinman Center for Energy Policy. And I'm going to share, and please just, I won't be able to see the chats right now, so if there's any issue, please do indeed just speak and interrupt me if there's any issue around seeing the slides or viewing anything, or if I need to pause or anything. So here we go. So again, my name is Melina Labucan-Massimo. I am the co-founder and senior director at Indigenous Climate Action. I'm a founder of a small organization called Sacred Earth Solar, and you can follow us both down below at our URLs below. Again, I want to locate and ground myself in where I come from as an Indigenous person born into my community. I was born in the northern boreal forest, the northern lungs of Mother Earth, as we call it, and it's in Lubicon Cree territory in northern Canada. So if anybody's ever been to Calgary in Alberta, it's about 8 hours north of there. We are from the northern lungs of Mother Earth, so we've tried very hard to protect it. My dad here in the top was actually hidden from the mission schools by my grandparents, my Kukum and Musum, that actually didn't speak English. They only spoke our language Cree before they passed, and my dad's a first language speaker on the right here, and he was hidden for about the first decade of his life from the mission schools because they had such detrimental impacts on the children. I come from the Alberta tar sands, where Dr. David Schindler, who is a renowned water expert and professor of ecology at the University of Alberta, where I did my first degree, he says there is nothing on this planet that compares to the destruction going on there. If there were a global prize for unsustainable development, the tar sands would be a clear winner because it is one of the largest industrial extraction zones on the planet to feed fossil oil and gas, and fracking our global addiction. And so I wanted to kind of preface the impacts that our communities are already experiencing by resource extraction. So because we are on limited time today, I do ask viewers to go to YouTube and search Oil on Lubicon Land, and you can learn more about the impacts that I won't have time to go into fully as I do in other presentations, but you can learn more about the oil and gas spills, as you see here in our territory, and other impacts to the land, water, and air. What we are definitely experiencing in the Alberta tar sands and fracking, where we are trying to transition to renewable energy, is cultural and environmental genocide, unfortunately, which is because of the encroachment and contamination and destruction of our territories. This results in a massive loss of culture, language, and traditions. So you can see the beauty of our land up here and what it's being replaced by. These are also pictures of our territory. Our shared territories, and the bottom two are from my territory. And you can see the type of landscapes that are being replaced when you see extractivism happening by industrialized landscapes, drained and polluted watersheds, and contaminated air, which make it very hard to live a traditional way of life, and just also an any day way of life of having contaminated air and water. It's very challenging and really challenging on the human health systems and the high rates of cancers that are happening in our territories. I wanted to connect this as well to understanding that with an Indigenous analysis, violence against the earth also results in violence against women, and we are seeing this in and around extractivism zones where we see colonial values of patriarchy and capitalism exploiting the land and exploiting our women and Indigenous bodies. And that's why we have, as you probably have heard in both America, in the United States, as well as in all across the Americas and also in Canada here, there was a missing and murdered Indigenous women's inquiry, and my sister being one of them, who had graduated from college and was found dead. And so these issues are very real and dear to our lives as we try to protect the land and try to protect our women at the same time. So in that question, I would like to pose, what does climate justice look like even in these contexts that we're already dealing with crises from many sides as Indigenous peoples, with colonialism, imperialism? And so, as you can see here, we have solar. What we've decided to do in my community that is completely surrounded by fossil fuel extraction is try to do small-scale community-based solar. And we did an implementation project called Pitapan in our language, which means new dawn, new era, where we're transitioning and returning also to what is, a very well-known term of zero-waste communities, where we, Indigenous peoples have always been zero-waste communities, and returning back to the land is a part of not having as much impact on the land as we have seen drastically in the 150 years since Canada has existed as a state. This is the project that we did. Again, it's a 20.8 kilowatt system. It powers our health center in the community, where we are completely surrounded by tar sands, fracking, logging, conventional oil and gas, where we're trying to power community buildings by solar to give the understanding that there are other technologies that we need to look at utilizing, but we also need to understand the extractivism that can happen as well as with renewable energy technology. So I want to preface that as well. But this is a small scale system that we implemented. We trained our young people. No one had ever seen actually solar panels in our community until we brought them in. And we put up 80 panels. This is Carlton. He's 21 at the time. We trained him to put up the project. We did a 20.8 top of pole mount system, which powers the health center in our community. And actually right below on the bottom part, you can see actually the community school. So kindergarten to grade 12 kids will see every day solar panels providing electricity for the school, where previously there had been no solar panels in that far north in that large of a scale of a project. Again, it's still a small scale, but we did connect to grid to be able to power the health center. We need to transition, and kids need to understand, I think the reason why we are dealing with the climate crisis abroad, internationally, both in Indigenous and non-Indigenous communities, unfortunately, is because we don't have climate literacy or energy literacy that is taught at a young age. So this is a part of what I've done, is gone into the schools and to talk about, what does energy literacy mean? What does it mean when you turn on a light bulb? What does it mean when you produce solar power, or what are fossil fuel extraction? What does that mean? So we did, as you can see here, we had a solar feast and a solar launch. This was done by and with and for the community. What did not come from the outside, it came from within the community to determine what we would like to see in our future. And we've also, through Sacred Earth and Indigenous Climate Action, we've helped solarize other communities that are very heavily dependent on diesel to power their communities, which is really hard on community systems and community health with the inhalation of diesel, which, can cause immense health issues. So we've seen, this is a community in Ontario where we've solarized their art center, also other solarizations. This is in so-called British Columbia in the north. And I wanted to, end my comments on what we've also done is with the TV show that was mentioned that I hosted, it's called Power to the People, and it profiles 14 Indigenous communities, went to 26 locations from coast to coast in so-called Canada, talking about and understanding the different types of technologies and the benefits and the cons around what makes sense for each community. And each community should have the ability to determine what they want and not have the external imposition, which has been happening to Indigenous communities since colonialism started in this continent. I want to close as well with the Indigenous worldview that all life is sacred, and I think that's what we need to see across the board is a critical paradigm shift for this to happen, because Indigenous peoples have intimate and reciprocal relationships with Mother Earth, and with that intimate relationship and reciprocity comes a sacred responsibility and a sacred responsibility to protect her. And so that's why you see so many Indigenous peoples on front lines standing to protect their homelands. And so what we do need to see is a stopping of criminalizing Indigenous peoples while we protect our homelands that not only benefit the Indigenous peoples to protect their water, land, and air, but also people surrounding non-Indigenous communities and also the climate as a whole. So we need to see rebuilding safer communities, community-based solar, food security, returning to land, and supporting Indigenous front lines. And I'll close with the idea of healing justice and understanding that there's a lot of trauma that happens when Indigenous communities are facing the trauma of extractivism on our territories, and that we need to have a system and a society that supports Indigenous peoples and coming out of these traumatic processes. And I'll close with a campaign that we just really have released called No More Dirty Banks. We're working with different celebrities to talk about, where does the fossil fuel financing come from to actually allow extractivism to happen? And we need the banking system as a whole to really respect Indigenous rights and also stop exacerbating the climate crisis by fueling fossil fuel extraction in our homelands, which is exacerbating. We are at the tipping point of the climate crisis, and I don't think there's any disagreement on that. So we really need to hold our banking systems accountable, just like we do with our institutions accountable, as well as government accountable. So thank you so much, and I will end my presentation there.
Thank you very much, Melina Labucan Massimo. That was a fascinating presentation, which has given us a lot of food for thought as we link to the next two presentations. So we'll come back with questions for you in a little bit. Now, I'd like to move on to our second speaker, Lucila Bettina Cruz Velasquez, who's joining us from Mexico. Bettina, just moments before you join us, Angela introduced you, so we can just go ahead and have you present for 10 minutes, please. If Bettina will be speaking in Spanish, as I think it will be the case, for those of you who do not speak Spanish, please make sure to push in the interpretation button to get the translation from our interpreter, Flor Tebano. Thank you. Bettina, you can start unmuting first, and then you can start. Oh, puedes empezar a hablar, perdón, Bettina. Si te... Ahí está. Gracias.
¿Me escuchan?
Perfectamente, perfectamente. Los próximos 10 minutos son tuyos. Gracias.
Yo envié una presentación, pero si me ¿puedo compartir pantalla yo desde aquí?
A ver, un momento, Bettina. Angela, tú puedes...
Yes, Bettina, if you could share your screen, that would be great.
Okay.
Hoy. No sé si ya está.
No.
¿Cómo es? ¿No, no aparece?
No, por ahora no, Bettina.
Pues.
Okay, I'll try to share the slides.
Mientras Bill prepara tus slides, Bettina, I want to tell everybody that I'm sitting at the University of Pennsylvania in the ancestral territory of the Lenape people, who were moved to Oklahoma. For the most part, there are still Lenape people in our territory. Bettina, ahora puedes seguir, por favor.
Ya está, creo, ¿verdad?
Sí, así es. Las diapositivas están a la vista de todos ahora. Puedes empezar, gracias.
Bueno, mi nombre es Bettina Cruz Velázquez. Acá hubo cambio de horario y yo esperaba que fuera a las 4, pero me llegó la invitación, dije tal vez es ahora, a las 3, aquí en México es. Y bueno, ya estoy aquí. Yo primero, el tema es megaproyecto eólico en el Istmo y defensa del territorio. Yo formo parte de la Asamblea de Pueblos Indígenas del Istmo en defensa de la tierra y del territorio aquí en México. Y rápidamente, como es muy poquito tiempo, la que sigue, pues quisiera presentarles, este es México y mi territorio es esta parte donde está la flecha, donde pasan los vientos nortes, vienen los vientos nortes, y que desde octubre hasta marzo, abril son nortes muy fuertes, por lo que en la siguiente diapositiva, eso fue uno de los elementos para que pues el capitalismo pensara, la siguiente diapositiva, pensara en que acá en la región podía instalarse un megaproyecto eólico de grandes escalas, ¿no? De gran escala. También nuestro territorio es una ruta migratoria importante para toda América, vienen aves desde el norte de América hasta Sudamérica y esta parte del Istmo pues es una ruta migratoria muy importante que no fue considerada para cuando hicieron las manifestaciones de impacto ambiental en mi territorio. La siguiente diapositiva nos va a mostrar cómo el territorio del Istmo de Tehuantepec está compuesto por, la siguiente diapositiva por favor, está compuesto por pueblos indígenas. La mayor parte de nuestro territorio vivimos 6 pueblos indígenas que interactuamos históricamente aquí. No somos pueblos que estamos muertos o que solamente estamos en la pared porque es lo que quisiera el gobierno mexicano, desaparecernos. Somos pueblos vivos, pueblos con identidad, con costumbres y con derechos sobre todo, con derechos sobre el territorio. Entonces, yo pertenezco al pueblo Vinizá, la gente de las nubes, la que sigue. Y entonces, por la razón esta que yo les planteé, la que sigue, por favor, la diapositiva que sigue. Desde 1980, en la región se interesaron por la región para pues, poner parques eólicos y entonces pues llegaron muchas empresas, esa diapositiva creo que no es una antes, llegaron muchas empresas y llegaron para ocupar nuestro territorio sin que nosotros nos supiéramos, ¿no? Supiéramos, nos dieran información. Es la 5, la diapositiva 5 la que tiene que estar puesta. Sí, llegaron imponiéndonos una visión de desarrollo como si la visión que nosotros tenemos de la vida no fuera importante, ¿no? Con un megaproyecto eólico para instalar en nuestro territorio, con gasoductos, minería, un corredor transísmico para trasladar mercancías y para aprovechar la instalación de muchas empresas para utilizar este parque eólico, ¿no? Entonces, a partir de eso hicieron un estudio donde nuestro territorio salió con un tipo de viento de 7, que era más que excelente. Después, en el otro mapita que está al lado, vemos cómo el gobierno se dedicó a repartir el territorio sin que nosotros los pueblos supiéramos, estuviéramos enterados, sin que se nos informara a las diferentes empresas, ¿no? que aquí estaban. Y posteriormente, bueno, ya en la foto podemos ver cómo están instalados en la región más de 2.000 aerogeneradores. Están instalados aerogeneradores, es un proyecto a gran escala, a diferencia de lo que Melina decía, que tienen proyectos pequeños que están utilizando las comunidades. Acá es un proyecto a gran escala donde pues son las empresas las que están aprovechándolo, ¿no? ¿Cómo llegaron las empresas aquí? Llegaron firmando contratos de usufructo, o sea que ellos van a usar los frutos de la tierra de 25 a 60 años, corrompiendo autoridades, utilizando a todas las instituciones de gobierno, ¿no? También contratando a la gente del pueblo para poder para poder convencer a la gente en nuestro propio idioma. Utilizaron nuestras costumbres también para ir introduciéndose en nuestro tejido social y sobre todo promesa de empleo y desarrollo a cambio de pagos por la tierra muy bajos, pero como producto ya de una política neoliberal con antelación desde 1992, el gobierno mexicano preparó el terreno para la entrada de estas empresas y para la entrada de la privatización de la tierra, porque gran parte del territorio mexicano y sobre todo en el Istmo de Tehuantepec es territorio indígena y son terrenos comunes, terrenos que el pueblo, que las comunidades deben de decidir en ellos, ¿no? En esa podemos ver que las grandes productoras de energía en el Istmo pues son muchas conocidas, están Iberdrola, está Gamesa, está Unión Fenosa, están todos los grandes monstruos energéticos que se pintan de verde y que se han pintado de verde. Si ustedes entran a la página de Iberdrola, dirán que es energía verde, sin embargo Iberdrola solamente tiene el 5% de producción de energía renovable. ¿Y cómo llega la energía? En México hubo una forma donde pudieron burlar la ley y se asociaron las empresas productoras y consumidoras. Y las empresas consumidoras son las que ustedes pueden ver en la pantalla, si conocen alguna, como Coca-Cola, como Celanese, como Siemens, como Moctezuma, hasta empresas mineras, hasta las mineras están consumiendo energía renovable, energía limpia, que es lo que dicen, ¿no? Y para nosotros el tema de la energía limpia, pues casi todas estas empresas y sobre todo Iberdrola se inscribió, ¿no? Se inscribió para poder vender esos bonos de carbono como parte de la producción o de energía limpia. Es una de las vendedoras de carbono y esos bonos de carbono, nosotros lo que pensamos es que pues es un permiso para poder contaminar, porque las empresas pues no cambian su producción o su forma de producción y solamente compran bonos de carbono y con eso ellas ya están dentro de la energía renovable. Sin embargo, en la próxima me la pueden poner, por favor, la próxima diapositiva. En esta diapositiva podemos mostrar cómo se da, ¿no? Esa primera fase del desarrollo eólico en el Istmo. Ahora tenemos en el Istmo de Tehuantepec un espacio como de 70,000 hectáreas, 2.100 aerogeneradores, 28 parques que ya se instalaron, donde no hay ningún beneficio para las comunidades, solamente el hecho de que el pago de la tierra, que es el 0.01% que pagan por la tierra. Las empresas se ampararon para no pagar impuestos municipales, que esos impuestos municipales podrían beneficiar a la comunidad. Nuestros pueblos, en el 2017 sufrimos un terremoto de 8.2, mucha gente quedó sin casa, mucha gente quedamos sin nada. Con el coronavirus no tenemos hospitales, no tenemos salud, mucha gente ha muerto y las empresas siguen ganando dinero, ¿no? Entonces no ha habido mínimamente el tema de que los impuestos hayan servido para el beneficio de las comunidades. La mayor parte de las empresas son españolas y francesas. Hay un parque operado por la Defensa Nacional, la Secretaría de Defensa, la Armada, pues, 4 operados por la Comisión Federal de Electricidad, que es una institución, la Institución Mexicana de Electricidad, y una de un instituto de eléctricos. Entonces, como pueden ver en en la diapositiva, pues el 71% de la energía eólica que se produce en el istmo es de autoabastecimiento. Es decir, es para autoabastecer a las mismas empresas que están provocando todo el tema del calentamiento global. O sea, cómo se ve que esto es una farsa completamente, ¿no? Entonces, el pequeño productor un 4%, productor independiente que vienen siendo ellos mismos, y un 4% supuestamente para la exportación, que se va principalmente a las zonas de Sudamérica, de Centroamérica, ¿no? Entonces, la siguiente diapositiva, después de eso, bueno, aquí la gente no se dio cuenta de lo que estaba pasando. Sin embargo, cuando empezamos la lucha por tratar de tumbar los contratos leoninos de 30 años, pues nos empezamos a organizar y empezó el tema de la criminalización hacia nosotros, el tema de la utilización de la fuerza pública, nos metieron a varios a la cárcel, nos amenazaron de muerte, tuvimos que salir de la región para poder seguir trabajando. Sin embargo, seguimos trabajando y sin embargo, los parques sí se pusieron, solamente pudimos parar un parque que era enorme y lo paramos con la organización de los pueblos indígenas de la región. Ese parque iba a afectar la playa, el mar, donde la gente saca pues la pesca para vivir, ¿no? Entonces, de no haber parado ese parque, la zona seguiría peor que a lo que estamos ahora, ¿no? La siguiente diapositiva. Es la siguiente diapositiva, por favor, o ya se terminó. Bueno, hay impactos socioambientales. Nosotros somos comunidades indígenas. Efectivamente hay esa ruptura del tejido social y comunitario porque nos ponen en contra a unos cuantos, los que reciben beneficios, contra la gran mayoría del pueblo. Hay conflictos intraétnicos e interétnicos también. Hay una migración de los desplazados porque disminuyó la producción la producción agrícola, porque los parques fragmentaron la tierra y había unas partes donde ya no se podía sembrar, y entonces la gente que ya no trabaja y que no le alcanza lo que le paga la empresa, pues se tiene que ir a buscar trabajo, y generalmente están trabajando en el tema de la construcción. También un tema muy importante fue el de la prostitución, ¿no? Las mujeres vistas como objeto por parte de los constructores, por parte de toda la gente y todos los hombres que llegaron a la región a trabajar. Hay un mayor encarecimiento de la vida, un incremento de la pobreza que podemos ver en la comunidad. Se ve, se palpa, se siente, ¿no? Aquí donde estamos, y un gran desplazamiento de actividades económicas de las mujeres, porque hay una característica de nuestros pueblos que donde toda la producción agrícola, pesquera, la producción de alimentos, finalmente los hombres son las que lo hacen, pero las mujeres nos encargamos de comercializarlas, de transformarlas y de comercializarlas. Al ya no haber ese espacio para trabajar, pues también ya no hay que vender, ¿no? Entonces tienen que vender otras cosas que tal vez vienen de China, entonces nos quitan el control de nuestra actividad económica, ¿no? La que sigue. Y de los impactos, porque creo que ya va a terminar, impactos socioambientales, bueno, ya dije algunos, pero cuando llegan las empresas, esto es lo que han hecho: han perforado nuestros suelos, no respetan a la madre tierra, no sé, metido mucho cemento, varilla, dicen que reubicaron a los animales que había ahí, pero bueno, dicen que los reubican, pero al lado de un parque está otro parque, yo no sé dónde los van a reubicar, porque no sé hasta dónde puedan llegar, son miles de hectáreas las que ya están ocupadas. Hay un peligro, por ejemplo, nosotros tenemos una raza endémica de maíz, que es zapalote chico, que es un maíz que a los 2 meses ya tenemos mazorca. ¿Por qué? Porque los fuertes vientos acaman la planta. Sin embargo, esta planta parece así como que tuviera elasticidad y se levanta cuando pasa el viento fuerte, ¿no? Entonces, eso también está en grave peligro. Y eso, por ejemplo, el maíz, pues es nuestro maíz, es nuestra vida, de eso vivimos, somos gente de maíz, ¿no? Y ya a partir del maíz también muchas mujeres tenemos muchas actividades económicas, y eso es parte de lo que este proyecto de intervención en nuestro territorio está creando, ¿no? La siguiente diapositiva, no sé si tengo alguna otra, es y aparte de los impactos socioambientales, está estos impactos donde hay contaminación. recurrentemente se están quemando los parques, los aerogeneradores se queman y eso ocasiona contaminación alrededor, contaminación del suelo, contaminación del agua, de los mantos freáticos, de la tierra, de las plantas. Hay una muerte de aves y de murciélagos muy fuerte, y el paisaje que nadie está hablando de él es un paisaje que ha cambiado completamente nuestra vida. Contaminación por medio del ruido, ¿no? También se da. Y bueno, ahorita hay un aumento de enfermedades en mujeres, sobre todo. Ha habido, la gente está manifestando que hay un decremento en la producción, por ejemplo, de leche de las vacas. ¿Por qué? Porque están en medio de esos aerogeneradores que todo el tiempo hay ruido, ¿no? Hay ruido, hay contaminación auditiva, hay contaminación visual, hay contaminación por muerte de aves. O sea, todo eso es lo que nos ha traído y no nos ha traído ningún beneficio. La que sigue, no sé si tenga tiempo todavía. Sí, hay otra. Entonces lo que nos han violentado, como ha dicho la otra compañera, también es el derecho a la libre determinación. Como pueblos indígenas tenemos derecho a la libre determinación reconocida en nuestra Constitución. Sin embargo, el gobierno hace caso omiso de este derecho. También el derecho a la autonomía, a decidir cómo podemos ejercer esa libre determinación, a derecho de ser diferentes, a pensar diferentes, a tener una identidad diferente, el derecho a hablar nuestra propia lengua, el derecho a vestir nuestra propia ropa, el derecho a una alimentación propia, de que no queremos esas grandes tiendas porque no traen lo que nosotros sembramos en esa tierra. Sin embargo, hay un proceso donde se nos está obligando a la comunidad a dejar el campo, a irse a trabajar fuera, a migrar y a comprar ya con dinero, porque antes hasta se intercambiaban las cosas en el mercado que estaba controlado por las mujeres. Tenemos el derecho a la práctica también de nuestra religiosidad, que es menospreciada por las empresas, ¿no? Es menospreciada y dicen que pues somos indígenas, que no sabemos nada y que practicamos ese tipo de religiosidad, adoramos a un cerro, adoramos al viento, adoramos al mar, al agua, ¿no? Entonces son cosas que pues tenemos derecho y que pues estamos en esa lucha. Y finalmente pues nuestra lucha, la que sigue, pues nuestra lucha es por la vida, y en esa lucha por la vida la participación de las mujeres aquí en el Istmo de Tehuantepec, y yo creo que en todo México, y yo creo que la compañera que me antecedió también lo ha dicho, o se ve pues eso, pues somos las mujeres, ¿no? Las mujeres no como reproductoras de vida nada más, sino como esas personas que nos preocupamos porque la vida continúe, ¿no? En la próxima diapositiva hay algunas fotos de compañeras que están participando y que han estado en esta lucha, que han recibido amenazas, que han recibido, que han ocupado sus territorios, ¿no? Y pues lo que ha visto también es que este proyecto eólico es la imposición de una visión del desarrollo industrial moderna y racista, porque, como ya les dije anteriormente, no respetan la diferencia, no respetan que seamos diferentes. También el otro tema es que nos delegan la responsabilidad de producir energía renovable, dicen ellos, para combatir el cambio climático. Un cambio climático que no fue provocado por los territorios. Y se ve porque el 80%, y es claro en el tema de que el 80% de los ecosistemas que aún permanecen, que son importantes, que aún permanecen sin estar contaminados, pues son ecosistemas que han cuidado los pueblos indígenas, ¿no? Y llegan con el discurso del desarrollo y el empleo, que es un discurso muy trillado y que es un discurso, pues, precisamente de este capitalismo de despojo. La energía es para las empresas, no es para la población, y nosotros, los que vivimos en las comunidades, pagamos la energía mucho más cara, ¿no? Y pues estamos aquí en la lucha, ¿no? Las mujeres, pues en la defensa del territorio, en la defensa de la vida, en la defensa de lo que somos nosotras, y pese a todo, pues a la criminalización, a la persecución y todo, pues aquí seguimos. La próxima diapositiva es una foto de mujeres en la lucha. Nosotras luchamos en todos los ámbitos, luchamos hablando, luchamos defendiendo la tierra de manera directa, luchamos en movilizaciones, luchamos estando en las barricadas, luchando, haciendo caravanas, campañas, firmando amparos, haciendo amparos, y efectivamente nuestra lucha ha implicado todos esos tipos de formas de lucha, ¿no? Desde la lucha legal, desde la lucha legal, la lucha en cuanto a la toma haciendo barricadas, las acciones directas, ¿no? La difusión, la implementación, las alianzas, ¿no? Todo eso hemos nosotros utilizado, tenemos el caso de una de las empresas que lo tenemos ahorita en la Comisión Interamericana de Desarrollo, esperando que sea pues analizada por la Comisión Interamericana, porque fue la primera, supuestamente el primer parque donde el gobierno mexicano hizo una consulta, pero esa consulta fue una consulta a mudo, una consulta donde la gente que estaba trabajando en el ayuntamiento y en algunos otros lugares las llevaron para decidir sobre la imposición de un parque eólico en territorio comunal de Juchitán, en territorio comunal de los pueblos indígenas. Entonces, pues, qué bueno que exista en lugares donde la energía renovable pueda ser utilizada por el pueblo. En todo caso, nosotros también estamos pensando que eso pueda ser, pero nunca de manera intensiva, nunca en manos de las empresas, que son las mismas que han ocasionado esta debacle, porque ellos lo que quieren, la energía, es para la venta, y nosotros finalmente, pues es para el uso y es para el beneficio de las comunidades. Muchísimas gracias.
Gracias a ti, Bettina. Thank you very much, Bettina. We will move now swiftly to our third guest or presenter, Ganur Maynard. Please, you can go ahead.
Well, good morning from Australia, and thank you very much for the introduction, Angela. As Angela mentioned, my name is Ganur Maynard. I'm a proud Gamilaroi man. It's from central New South Wales, but I grew up in the state's eastern coast near the lands of the Worimi people, which are just north of Sydney, a little bit north of Sydney. I've worked as a lawyer and a researcher in a variety of fields affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, including native title, environmental law, and criminal sentencing. I've also worked for international law firms in Germany and Australia on the financing and approval of renewable energy projects. And my law thesis at university focused on renewable energy development on native title land. And after I graduated, I worked at the Kimberley Land Council and for the Australian National University in Broome, Western Australia, which is up in the northwestern corner of the country. And in that work, I focused on the opportunities and risks of the energy transition for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And I continued to work with researchers at the ANU during my time as a solicitor in Sydney and in my current role as a judicial clerk at the Federal Court of Australia in Melbourne. Now, I thought I'd give a little bit of context to the energy transition in Australia and the experience of Indigenous peoples here for an international audience. In Australia, the energy transition has focused on the installation of rooftop solar power, the decommissioning of coal-fired power stations, the establishment of large-scale solar and wind farms, and the development of energy storage facilities. Waste-to-energy projects and electric vehicles have played a smaller but growing role in the transition. There's been significant debate in this country about whether natural gas and carbon capture and storage technology have roles to play in the energy transition. And the high price of natural gas on the international energy market and Australia's natural endowment of gas resources have encouraged some Australian governments and industry groups to promote a gas-led recovery from the COVID-19 recession. And this would involve very large-scale extraction projects and could employ conventional mining technologies as well as fracking. In Australia, fossil fuels contribute more than 3/4 of the electricity generation for domestic use, with the rest coming from renewable energy sources. And the share contributed by renewable energy is growing rapidly. 80% of Australia's electricity rather is consumed on the national electricity market, which is one of the largest interconnected electricity systems in the world. It's a single transmission network that runs, if you're familiar with the geography of Australia, from around Cape York up the northern tip of Queensland, all the way down to the island of Tasmania, and then westwards across to South Australia. Now, this market will play a key role in Australia's energy transition. It's governed by an independent regulator and operated by another independent government agency. And this second agency is responsible for developing a roadmap that will guide the development of the electricity market over the next 20 years. This development involves achieving net zero emissions in the market by 2050. Now, in order to firm intermittent renewable energy generation and support new low emissions technologies such as electric vehicles and hydrogen generation, the market will have to double the electricity it now delivers. It will have to do this without any coal generation, which currently accounts for 2/3 of the market's output. And this requires a 9-fold increase in utility scale variable renewable energy capacity and a 5-fold increase in distributed photovoltaics, which is rooftop solar. It will also require more than 10,000 kilometers of new transmission infrastructure. According to the energy market operator, the land needed for major variable renewable energy storage and transmission projects to reach these goals is unprecedented. Beyond electricity generation for domestic use in Australia, there are some nascent projects for renewable energy export. Massive renewable energy hubs have been proposed in coastal locations in Western Australia and Queensland, with the vision that the electricity generated will be used in electrolysis to produce hydrogen for export to Asia. In the Northern Territory, a huge solar panel project is planned to generate electricity for transmission to Singapore via undersea cables. These projects, and others like them, will require vast amounts of Indigenous land and will have significant impacts on the environment and cultural heritage. The prospect that Indigenous peoples will bear the brunt of the negative impacts of renewable energy development is already being discussed as another example of an environmental injustice. The experience of Indigenous peoples with the energy transition in Australia will be influenced by the lack of coordination at the federal level, for which Australia is becoming infamous. The increasing frequency and intensity of natural disasters, such as bushfires and flooding, combined with the overwhelming evidence about the causes and consequences of global heating, have pressured the national government to develop targets to reach net zero emissions by 2050. These targets, which are not mandated by legislation, are supposed to be achieved by investment in new and emerging low emissions technologies. The government's approach is being criticised by commentators for lacking certainty. Concurrently, the federal government has struggled to define a coherent national approach to Indigenous rights and self-determination. In 2017, a series of Indigenous-run conferences across the country resulted in the promulgation of the Uluru Statement from the Heart, a consensus document reflecting the demands of a wide range of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities for constitutional and political change. The Uluru Statement called for the establishment of a constitutionally enshrined entity for Indigenous representatives to advise federal parliament about laws affecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, so the so-called voice to parliament. The statement also called for national treaty making and truth-telling processes. However, the government rejected the proposal for the voice to parliament on the basis that it would not succeed in a referendum. Changing the Australian Constitution requires a majority vote of all eligible Australian citizens, as well as an affirmative vote in the majority of the Australian states. Despite polling suggesting that the majority of Australians do support the idea of better Indigenous input in the making of legislation that affects us, the government has stuck by its position. Now, the vacuum left by the federal government has started to be filled by the states and territories of Australia. Like Canada and the US, Australia is a federation. Most Australian state and territory governments have developed their own plans for reducing carbon emissions, including by incentivising renewable energy development by changes to environmental and planning legislation and by the deployment of financial incentives. Furthermore, some state and territory governments have started to negotiate treaties with Indigenous peoples or have sought to establish truth-telling commissions. However, these developments are at a very early stage. Now, to summarise in relation to the energy transition here, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples know that vast amounts of land will be used to develop new projects. There are some indications of where these projects are likely to be located and what impacts they will have on Indigenous lands and cultures. However, the lack of a national strategy means much remains unknown, especially as regards the development of large-scale projects for energy export and the potential for expansion of mining of minerals to be used in the transition. Simultaneously, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples have been frustrated by the government's failure to support constitutional reform and treaty making and truth-telling processes that we've been asking for, which has limited the degree to which Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples can participate in national policy making, including in relation to the energy transition. The absence of a federal plan for these matters has meant that Australian states and territories have developed their own plans and strategies for the energy transition and separately for Indigenous affairs. In this context, Indigenous peoples in Australia will have to be strategic and well informed of our position to mitigate the risks of the energy transition and maximise any opportunities that we are interested in pursuing. This means understanding the economic and political drivers of the energy transition generally and the motivations behind particular projects. It also means being aware of the legal rights and interests that we have, how they can be used to further our aims or protect ourselves, but also what limits there are to the legal system, especially in the context of the kind of development involved in the energy transition.
Thank you very much, Kanur. Thank you indeed to the three presenters for three very thought-provoking and stimulating presentations. I will get us started as we also collect questions from the audience. The audience who is participating in this webinar can include questions in the chat, and I would be happy to go through them and read them to our panelists. Well, that may soon happen. I would like to start the Q&A by drawing some commonalities between the three presentations. Bettina, estoy casi segura que tú estás recibiendo la traducción de lo que estoy diciendo, ¿no es así? Okay, I'm going to assume that I can ask these questions in English. Bettina, voy a hacer las preguntas en inglés, asumiendo que tú estás recibiendo la traducción en el canal de interpretación. Gracias. So I was saying there are certain, important common threads in your presentation. One of them is the issue of environmental injustice in Indigenous territories. It was striking to see the photos, both of the oil sands in Alberta, as well as the wind farms in the Isthmus of Mexico. We see the way in which, even though these are different types of energy production, both when done in massive scale with the intention of big scale profit behind more than sustainable use and sustainable exploitation. What we see instead is extractivism, as some of you have mentioned. So behind this story, of course, we have colonialism, capitalism of dispossession, as Bettina mentioned, with the effects that many of you mentioned of criminalization of Indigenous protest, forced migration that is produced in Indigenous territories, as well as many other negative externalities of intense extractive activities, such as prostitution or the complete turnover of the local culture and possibly the ancestral traditions. So my question for Bettina and Melina to get us started is, both of you talked about the leadership of women in different ways. Melina made the comment that justice had to be reached for missing women and girls. So in a way, they are present, but more as victims, perhaps. But then the leadership of Melina with her group and in her community is certainly not worthy. And the same, Bettina talked about women who are defenders of the territory and taking a very active role. With colonialism and capitalism, we also had patriarchy. So my question to both of you as Indigenous women is, what's the role for leadership of women within your communities? Do you see a break with patriarchy within the Indigenous communities and movement that could lead to new leadership that perhaps will not be co-opted, or perhaps will not have the problems that we have seen in the implementation of certain rights, such as, for example, the implementation of consulta in Mexico that was how can I put it, corrupted by the cooptation of leaders or the presentation of certain particular favors. So that's my question for you. And for Ganur, it's very interesting that in the three presentations we have today, Mexico, Canada, and Australia, these are all indeed federal countries. So do you see in federal countries the possibility for the intermediate level of government, what would be states, or in Mexico, or provinces in Australia, sorry, in Canada, do you see a possibility for that intermediate level of government to have a more proactive role, perhaps in defending the self-determination of Indigenous nations and helping the implementation of their rights in a more meaningful way? Or do you think that we'll see more of the same, even as states may get more involved in the energy transition? So we could perhaps start in the order that you presented, if you don't mind. We'll reverse that order in the next round of questions. So Melina, if you could please go first.
Sure, thank you. So what is my role, or what is the role of women in my community? So traditionally, Indigenous women we had matriarchal or matrilocal systems of governance. So women's leadership was very much respected, and there was equality and shared decision making both between Indigenous women and Indigenous men. And we still have elders councils, we still have youth councils, but currently what's happening, because there is a foreign colonial imposition of our leadership, where we have what we call here in so-called Canada, chief, band, and council systems, that is a federally Canadian government imposed system that disregards the traditional form of governance systems within Indigenous communities that has existed here in Canada since time immemorial. Before Canada existed 150 years ago, we've had traditional governance systems that have existed for millennia. And unfortunately, right now what we see is matriarchal systems that are running in opposition, or a lot of times not kind of coming into like, it just is not functioning well, because they're coming into like combat with one another, where we have colonial systems that are imposed upon our communities and traditional systems that are not being respected, and it's actually undermining women's leadership and traditional governance structures. So that is the kind of dynamics that we're currently dealing with, which is very challenging because it is definitely a divide and conquer tactic, unfortunately, imposed by the Canadian government. You know, we have we have in Canada, it's called the Indian Act, which has been repeatedly called out of its racist and colonial policies, and actually the model of apartheid was based that South Africa actually was adopted from the Indian Act system here in Canada. It was a blueprint to help with segregation, to help with apartheid, to help with, we actually had to have land passes to leave our traditional territories. We actually didn't have the right to vote until 1960, even though non-Indigenous women in 1918 had the right to vote here in Canada, but Indigenous peoples, both men and women, didn't actually have the right to vote until 1960 here in so-called Canada, as well as not being able to attain a lawyer. Our ceremonies, our traditional governance systems were prohibited till the 1960s legally through this Indian Act. So you can see there is a lot of colonial impact that still affects our governance systems today. And so we definitely see them as divide and conquer tactics. So when we have projects sometimes that traditional forms of governance do not agree with the banned Indian Act imposed government systems, may agree with, but they're not doing the due diligence to do the shared decision making, which is a traditional form of consensus-based decision making, including women and men and elders and youth within these types of governance structures, are being disregarded. And so it's usually just men. A lot of times, unfortunately, there's some women chiefs that are elected in these ways, but a lot of them are men, and unfortunately they're not engaging all the time with their actual communities when it comes to projects that definitely impact our land, water, and territories. And so I'll leave it at that, but it is definitely an issue that we are still dealing with today.
Thank you very much, Melina. Bettina, ¿nos podrías decir entonces cuál es el rol de las mujeres indígenas en el sistema de organización tradicional y cómo se relaciona tal vez con los sistemas que han tenido en el sistema colonial?
Bueno, efectivamente, el rol de las mujeres indígenas aquí en la región, no puedo decir que de todo México, porque en México pues sabemos 68 pueblos indígenas y cada pueblo indígena tiene su forma de organización, somos diversos, ¿no? Pero en la región del Istmo de Tehuantepec, sobre todo las mujeres Vinizá, hemos tenido un rol preponderante, sobre todo en el tema, por ejemplo, del manejo de los recursos para la vida, ¿no? El manejo de la comida, el manejo de lo que viene del campo, como les dije, es algo muy importante. Y también, y nosotros en nuestra casa tenemos un lugar, un espacio importante destinado a un altar, y es un altar que efectivamente con la colonia pues entraron los santos, entraron las cruces, pero también en ese altar están nuestros ancestros y nuestras ancestras, ¿no? Y en ese altar se toman las decisiones más importantes en la vida de la familia, y lo toman los hombres y las mujeres. No obstante, con la llegada de estos parques eólicos, los empresarios lo que hicieron fue tomar decisiones con los hombres, rompiendo efectivamente este lazo, ¿no? Rompiendo esta característica que tenemos en la región, donde las mujeres y los hombres tomaban esta decisión. La tomaron a los hombres solamente porque efectivamente en la ley mexicana existe que la posesión de la tierra y la propiedad de la tierra es del hombre. Entonces, por eso lo hicieron. Sin embargo, y rompieron efectivamente con eso. Los otros elementos pues son el tema de la prostitución, ¿no? El tema también de que utilizaron mujeres para engañar a los hombres, o sea, llegaban las mujeres con el contrato y le decían firma, ¿no? Y la verdad es que muchos sí firmaron por estar nada más ahora sí que abriendo la boca ahí con las muchachas, y firmaron y ni siquiera leyeron los contratos que les llevaban, ¿no? Entonces, eso definitivamente, pues sí rompe con las dinámicas sociales y nuestras redes sociales. Están erosionando o están provocando rupturas. También al llegar en nuestras fiestas, llegan a nuestras fiestas y dicen, pues yo pongo el becerro, yo pongo la res, yo pongo esto, para que ustedes ya no se preocupen. Entonces, están tratando de entrar por ese medio en nuestros rituales para que sean aceptados por nuestra comunidad, ¿no? Entonces, hay una ruptura con nuestras costumbres, con nuestras formas de ser y sobre todo en el papel preponderante de la mujer. No podríamos decir que en Juchitán tenemos matriarcado, porque hay toda una idea de que acá las mujeres somos las que mandamos, ¿no? Quizás no mandemos todo, pero sí tenemos un rol muy preponderante en la reproducción de la vida, en la reproducción de la cultura, en la reproducción de la identidad, en la reproducción de todos los rasgos que nos hacen ser como pueblos indígenas. Somos las que más hablamos en la lengua, también quizás por el tema de que también somos las que menos vamos a la escuela, ¿no? Porque ahí está este rol del patriarcado de que la mujer no va a la escuela porque se va a casar o va a estar con un hombre que la va a mantener. Entonces, muchas mujeres acá son analfabetas, no van a la escuela, no saben leer, no saben escribir, pero sí saben hacer muchas cosas que lo que hace es reproducir nuestra vida, ¿no? Después de más de 500 años de dominación colonial, en México y en la región del Istmo de Tehuantepec, mi comunidad, que es Juchitán, tenemos el 80% de hablantes del zapoteco, ¿no? Que es algo muy importante. Y asimismo, bueno, se va reproduciendo nuestra lengua, porque nuestra lengua es también lo que nos da la idea de lo que trata nuestra vida. Nuestra lengua demuestra de lo que nosotros somos, es nuestra cosmovisión, pues, ¿no? Entonces, sí hay, claro, una irrupción violenta por parte de las empresas, ¿no? Porque yo lo dije, es una irrupción racista, porque consideran que somos menos, que no valemos tanto y que no sabemos lo que tenemos y que por eso pueden llegar y darnos cualquier cosa por nuestra tierra sin explicarnos qué tanto es lo que van a usar y qué tanto es lo que ellos van a ganar, ¿no? Todo ese valor de uso que ellos tienen.
Gracias, Bettina. Muchísimas gracias. Quisiera dar también oportunidad a más preguntas que están apareciendo en el chat. So, Ganur, we are moving to you, please. If you could talk a little bit about the role of a state government. So you see there, you know, an entry point for more meaningful defense of Indigenous rights, or not necessarily?
Oh, look, I think absolutely different levels of government have a role to play. The reality with the energy transition is because of its size and scale, many different actors are going to determine how the transition proceeds and how fairly Indigenous rights and interests are treated. And in a federal system in Australia, like in Canada, the US, and I presume Mexico, you have a central government, a federal government of limited jurisdiction, delineated by the terms of the Constitution. And then you have state governments, usually with plenary powers to make law and policy, circumscribed, of course, by any inconsistency with federal legislation. And this basically means that while in Australia, for example, the Commonwealth government is responsible for making laws with regard to certain topics such as taxation or corporations, state powers retain a very important role, especially around environmental protection laws and planning and development laws. And this means that Indigenous groups in Australia are very careful and strategic about how they lobby state governments, especially governments that might be more progressive than the federal government. That's an advantage of a federal system, that you have some different forums to shop in. And beyond just state governments, of course, as we've been speaking about this morning, capitalism plays a huge role in this energy transition, and the policies of companies that they adopt internally also can play a very big role. And so Indigenous peoples lobbying not only state and federal governments, so to speak, but also private corporations, especially banks and financiers, and all of the other government and non-government entities involved in this transition are going to be really important subjects of Indigenous protest. And if I may indulge myself, I might just make one further point briefly, which is that although I'd like to be sanguine about the different types of rights and legal recourses that Indigenous people have at our disposal, we need to be realistic about the extent to which these rights can actually protect our interests in practice. Now, Bettina's spoken about constitutionally enshrine rights in Mexico and recourse to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. We're nowhere near that level in Australia. We're nowhere near the level of having legislated rights of self-determination or legislated rights of free and prior informed consent to development of renewable energy or other projects on Indigenous land. And this just goes to show, or Bettina's the experience of Indigenous peoples in Mexico goes to show that even if we were to get those rights, there's no guarantee that they will be respected and that they will be enforceable in practice. You know, we have to be very realistic about the limits that legal rights can give Indigenous peoples when we live in a system that's dominated by the powers of colonialism, of capitalism, and of patriarchy, as you've been saying.
I'm very fond of a sentence or a phrase that a lawyer who defends Indigenous rights in Argentina recently gave in a presentation to one of my classes here. And he said, the structures don't go to court. In other words, you know, it's very hard to use the colonial legal system to put in the seat of the prosecuted or the accused structures such as capitalism, such as colonialism, such as, you know, the long history of segregation, racism that we've had against marginalized communities, including Indigenous communities. So I can 100% agree, and that, you know, that phrase keeps popping up. You know, the biggest structures that are promoting these extractive development do not go to trial. So there is only a limit to how much we can pursue through legal channels. Yet there are two questions in the chat that I think are very important to continue that conversation, and that touch upon some of the issues that Ganer was just mentioning. One will refer to the national level and the other one to the international level. So I'll read both together in the interest of time, such that you can decide with which question you want to engage the most. So Alejandro Esquelfo asks, what are the steps that can be taken and or that have been taken to develop a national agenda for the protection of Indigenous communities? And as you think of this national agenda for protection of Indigenous communities, you know, you could also think outside of the legal framework. So that's the first question, which I'll pose to the three of you in each of your countries. The second question comes from my colleague, Kathy Barch, who is asking, to what extent have you seen the international community, whether it is the UN, the Organization of American States, or perhaps even international NGOs, play a role in supporting the Indigenous struggles for rights and lands and for renewable resources? in your opinion, could they help more? So I'll go in the reverse order. So Gunnar, if you'd like to start addressing either both or one of these questions, please do so.
Thank you, and I'll try to be as brief as I can. The national agenda steps in Australia have been taken, as I mentioned in my presentation. There's a very coherent and clear agenda in Australia for Indigenous representation to federal parliament, for a process of treaty making at the national, state, and other levels in Australia. And by treaty making, I just mean agreements between Indigenous peoples and government entities that involve a relationship of mutual respect as polities, recognition of Indigenous sovereignty, and that being the starting point for deciding what our respective rights are in relation to land, resources, and development. And finally, the third limb was truth-telling, which in Australia has really been inspired by the Canadian Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission. This notion that when a group has been treated unfairly, and there's very deep historical explanations for disadvantage, both past, present, and future, there needs to be a reckoning with why, or an explanation as to why things are as they are today, and a reckoning with what with the reasons for those circumstances. And I think that's the agenda. But the crucial part to the question, I think, is that the steps that were taken to develop that agenda were a series of dialogues, 13 dialogues across the country of Australia, which involved unprecedented engagement with Indigenous people. They were all Indigenous-led discussions, and the agenda was one that was produced and conceived of by Indigenous people. It wasn't imposed on us. There weren't limits set around what was possible and what wasn't. It allowed us to think of how, it allowed us to conceive of the plan. The second point, the international organisations. I'll speak very briefly from the experience of an Australian. We have a very, I think it's fair to say, recalcitrant government when it comes to the UN and international bodies. We have a dualist legal system, so international law doesn't automatically become binding law in Australia, like in many other countries. And Australian governments are pretty free to ignore even quite damning UN reports on Indigenous rights in this country. But one way that international organisations can have a big impact is by controlling finance, and perhaps less so in a developed country like Australia, but standards adopted by the International Finance Corporation, for example, the lending arm of the World Bank for a lot of development around free and prior informed consent, while imperfect, provided a potential pathway for stronger protections around Indigenous rights by basically turning off the tap of finance for companies that seek to develop projects on Indigenous lands without people's consent. And that's all from me.
Fascinating. Thank you so much, Gunnar. I did not know about this instrument that the World Bank had in its toolbox. So thank you so much for that information, as well as the rest of the answer. Bettina, ¿quisieras seguir, por favor, diciendo si hay una agenda nacional o cómo han actuado los organismos internacionales en la defensa de los derechos indígenas?
Bueno, aquí en México, hasta 1994, pues los pueblos indígenas estábamos invisibilizados aún en la Constitución, ¿no? No se hablaba de que que éramos una nación supuestamente multicultural, ¿no? Y que el idioma nacional era el español en ese momento, ¿no? Tuvo que haber un levantamiento armado en Chiapas con el Ejército Zapatista de Liberación Nacional, que puso en la agenda del país el tema de los pueblos indígenas. Y hubo unos diálogos que se llamaron los diálogos de San Andrés, donde el gobierno, el Ejército Zapatista y personas también que trabajan en los temas indígenas, hubo mesas de trabajo, hubo acuerdos de cómo incorporar este tema en la Constitución, tenernos a nosotros, los pueblos indígenas, como sujetos jurídicos, ¿no? Para tener la capacidad de ejercer los recursos y poder decidir cómo queremos vivir en nuestros territorios. No obstante, eso no fue posible, ¿no? Se llegaron a los acuerdos de San Andrés, sin embargo, el gobierno no realizó y no respetó los acuerdos de San Andrés, y pues se inició una lucha ya no solamente porque tuviera que tener los pueblos indígenas el derecho en las leyes, sino que teníamos que hacerlo por nosotros mismos, ¿no? O sea, tomar nuestro derecho, porque nosotros somos los pueblos originarios. Nosotros no tenemos que pedir permiso a nadie. Somos los que estamos aquí, los que nacimos aquí, y ese es nuestro territorio. Y entonces empezamos a luchar por el tema de la libre determinación y la autonomía. Posteriormente, hasta el 2011, hubo una reforma constitucional al artículo 1 constitucional y 2 constitucional del país, donde se reconoce que México es un país multicultural formado por los pueblos originarios que estaban antes de la colonia, ¿no? Y que como tal tenemos derecho. Y ya no se hablaba del idioma español como el idioma nacional, sino los diferentes idiomas de nuestros pueblos. Eso mínimamente es una base con la que hemos estado luchando para que nos respeten a nivel legal el tema de nuestros derechos, pero está muy lejos, está en la Constitución, pero bien saben el gobierno y las empresas cómo burlar todo lo que hay en la Constitución, ¿no? Y en el tema de las organizaciones internacionales, bueno, yo creo que, por ejemplo, la ONU ha planteado, hay un tema sobre empresas y derechos humanos, pero efectivamente eso tampoco se cumple, ¿no? Hay muchos, nosotros, el Banco Mundial, finalmente el Banco Mundial es el que decide la agenda, ¿no? La agenda de desarrollo. Entonces, nosotros, ¿qué le vamos a pedir al Banco Mundial? Nosotros interpelamos, por ejemplo, al Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo con uno de los megaproyectos eólicos. Tuvimos que hacer los pasos que estaban pidiendo ellos para exigirles que vinieran a hacer una investigación, que se llamaba el mecanismo de investigación del Banco Interamericano. Finalmente vinieron y finalmente comprobaron que efectivamente la empresa y el gobierno estaba violando nuestros derechos, ¿no? Pero miren lo que hicieron. Retiraron el recurso de esa empresa, pero esa empresa se convirtió en otra, se llevó el proyecto a otro lado, nosotros le dijimos, pues no les des el dinero. No, dicen, porque es otra empresa, cuando era todo lo mismo. O sea que yo la verdad es que siento, y acá lo que sentimos es que es mucha simulación. Es como que sí están defendiendo, pero no están defendiendo realmente. Nunca nos dan el derecho. Siempre lo tenemos que tomar. Eso es lo que hacemos. Siempre tenemos que estar luchando por nuestros derechos. Hacer muchas acciones directas que van acompañadas, como ya digo, de acciones legales, de acciones de difusión, entonces, y de otro tipo de acciones para poder defender nuestros derechos. Y interpelar al gobierno de que constitucionalmente está. Y además con la modificación del primero constitucional, México puso los tratados internacionales al mismo nivel que la Constitución. Y nosotros siempre estamos peleando porque que respete algunos tratados que han avanzado en cuanto a los derechos de los pueblos originarios, ¿no? Pero eso siempre hay que estar luchando, siempre. No podemos bajar la guardia porque así solo no nos lo dan. Tenemos que exigir el respeto a nuestros derechos y no el reconocimiento, porque el reconocimiento nos los damos nosotros mismos. No necesitamos el reconocimiento del gobierno ni de ningún otro. Gracias.
Muchas gracias a ti, Bettina. So now, Melina, you have the last word on these questions. And if we have then a little bit of time, we may go over time, but we have 2 excellent questions in the chat that are more specific. So if everyone agrees, we could stay perhaps 5 minutes past 5:30. But Melina, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll try to answer quickly, but these are big questions. So what steps are being taken? So I would say what is incredibly important is that to acknowledge the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Indigenous peoples worked on this for decades in the UN system. And specifically, I want to name free, prior, and informed consent, which should in fact give Indigenous communities the right to say no, happening in our, with projects happening in our homelands, but we do not see this happening. And even when Indigenous communities say no, our rights are being trampled and projects still go ahead. As well, I want to mention that in Canada, we have constitutionally enshrined rights as well under Section 35 that recognizes Indigenous rights and title. But again, as has been mentioned before, these systems do not allow for communities' rights to actually be respected and protected. And communities over and over through the years have consistently gone into legal actions, into court to protect our rights, and they spend millions of dollars to already prove our inherent rights. And you can look up the Delgomith decision, which is a very Supreme Court precedent decision making, as well as the Sparrow decision. There's a lot of precedent setting in Indigenous law around these rights and title cases. But I also do want to talk about the recommendations that exist within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was done here, that took years to compile, that there was Indigenous scholars, lawyers, community members that took part, that gave testimonials, and this is literally volumes, and there is recommendations that I would say, because this is too short to discuss the step-by-step process, please look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission that was done here in Canada, as well as the recommendations that were put forward by the National Inquiry on the Rights of Indigenous, or the National Inquiry on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Relatives, which also my family also testified at. So there's these recommendations that have been put forward over and over repeatedly to protect Indigenous communities, to respect Indigenous rights, and these steps can be implemented. But we don't see that happening enough here, even within Canada, where these national inquiries have been done. So communities are taking matters into their own hands. We're creating our own stewardship and land management models. We're creating climate strategies, which is why we profiled communities that are already doing this in Power to the People, that show actual communities doing this in their homelands. I wanted to say quickly, we cannot replicate the same systems of harm that have created climate change and environmental degradation. So we need that to be different with renewable energies when they're implemented. Otherwise, we're failing again. And, the last part I'll say, to the extent of which the international community, the UN and NGOs have played a supporting role. Could they help more? I mean, yes, of course, they could definitely help more. I think, I myself have been involved in UN processes and a variety of different UN bodies for the past 20 years. I think they help, but unfortunately, many of these condemnations and recommendations put forward by the UN are not binding. So my experience with this, it only can go so far, unfortunately. Also working with NGOs, they can be helpful when our non-Indigenous allies are working in solidarity with our communities and not taking a top-down approach, which unfortunately was, a model of the past that can no longer continue. That they really have to work hand in hand with Indigenous communities and take direction from our communities, because we know the problems, so therefore we know the solutions, and we can't have these external models again being implemented top down into our communities. For example, I want to really lastly comment on what both Bettina and Gunnar talked about with the banking systems, and we definitely need to address the banking systems globally, and also the banks within our collective state countries, to address where financing is coming from. When when the projects are being funded, they are coming from financing from banks, which are violating Indigenous rights and exacerbating the climate change. This morning, I spoke at the Royal Bank of Canada's AGM to question them on their financing of fossil fuels, because they are number one in Canada of fossil fuel funder and top fifth of the world of funding fossil fuels. So we need to really ensure that our banking systems are going in the right track and not doubling down on fossil fuel expansion, but instead transitioning and reducing the amount of emissions that are coming out of places like Canada, which has never been able to meet its international climate negotiations and climate commitments ever. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melina. Thank you so much for being so concise. I apologize that time always flies, but we have two very pointed questions in the chat that I think are really very important to bring. So if you will all allow me a few more minutes. One question is for you, Melina. It comes from actually one of the organizers, Angela Pachon, from the Kleinman Center. So she asked, what policies in an oil-producing region such as Alberta have provided the incentives for the creation of renewable energy companies owned and operated by Indigenous groups such as yours? So again, what policies have, if there were policies indeed, have made that possible? And the other question is for Bettina. Bettina, this is a rather specific question, so hopefully you can, enlighten us succinctly. Mariana Lupton pregunta, and I'm going to read it in Spanish. Ella dice, trabajando en el área de Oaxaca, nuestro proyecto se comunicó con un grupo ejidal que organizó los beneficios del proyecto que estábamos ofreciendo. Ellos dijeron que no eran comunidad indígena en el área proyectada. Entonces, Marianne Lupton pregunta, ¿cómo es que los grupos ejidales se encajan con la situación de los pueblos indígenas? ¿Ellos trabajan con o en contra de los grupos indígenas o están completamente separados? Y te voy a pedir si por favor pudieras contestar brevemente, siendo que estamos pasados del tiempo, pero le daré la palabra primero a Melina y luego a ti, Bettina. Melina, you can go first, please.
Okay, thank you. So in oil producing regions like Alberta, there have been in the past a renewable energy program that was brought in by a previous government, which has now been done away with another right-wing government coming into play. Previously, when we implemented the renewable energy project that I showed back home, there wasn't renewable energy policy to create these incentives. There was just a microgrid ability to connect to grid, but there was an incentive. So I actually had to fundraise close to $100,000 to put these projects up, which we didn't take company money, we didn't take government money. We just, I did philanthropic funding, and so we implemented in that way. But after that, then there was a government that came in for about a number of years, like 4 to 5 years, that was more left center, I would say, and they did implement a renewable energy policy. But again, with this new government that has just come in for the past 2 years, the right-wing government of Kenny, he is Alberta Premier, he has done away again with these incentives. So it really depends on the day and age. So this has, unfortunately, with the renewable energy programs that were done away with, it really did not allow for the growth that was going to happen within Alberta of renewable energy companies that were owned and operated by Indigenous communities, where we saw, appropriate, like Bettina said, Indigenous communities have been taken advantage of in communities. The low payments to communities is unacceptable. And what we were seeing with these new incentives and with policy that ensured that Indigenous communities were able to get equitable ownership and partnership and make the decisions with themselves that these are the types of projects they wanted going forward, and were able to get power purchase agreements for these types of projects. These again were done away with, unfortunately, with the new government. So it just depends on the day and age of what government we have, and we've seen this across the board in other provinces of Canada, like the Green Energy Act, which was also done away with in Ontario. So unfortunately, it just really depends on the government of the day and who's in and what type of policies that they're able to implement within the time frame that they're in office. Thank you.
Thank you, Bettina. You once again showed the importance of state level government. The intermediate level once again comes in as a relevant arena. Bettina, would you like to, podrías contestar sobre ejidos y grupos indígenas, por favor?
Ajá. Bueno, acá aquí en la región del Istmo, yo no sé cuál sea el caso del que se habla, pero aquí en la región del Istmo, la mayoría de los pueblos somos pueblos indígenas, somos pueblos originarios, y la tenencia de la tierra, tenemos 3 tipos de tenencia de la tierra: ejidal, comunal y propiedad privada. la mayoría es comunal, que quiere decir que es la comunidad agraria la que decide sobre la tierra, y que puede otorgar una parte de la tierra a la familia para que trabaje esa tierra, pero no es su tierra, o sea, no es dueño completamente de la tierra, sino es la posesión. ¿No? Es la posesión de la tierra. Lo ejidal, pues, surge después de la Revolución Mexicana, cuando hay un repartimiento de tierras, pero tiene más o menos la misma estructura jurídica. Y la privada, bueno, pues es propiedad privada. Entonces, aquí lo que ha pasado es que, por ejemplo, el gobierno, para el tema de la producción de la energía eléctrica, solamente, por ejemplo, ese formato del autoabastecimiento, solamente podían ser los productores, las empresas que van a producir y otra empresa que va a consumir, ¿no? No podía ser una comunidad indígena, no tiene derecho a producir energía y sobre todo no tiene derecho a subir la energía a la línea de transmisión y distribuirla y venderla. Finalmente, eso es algo que está en la Constitución y que está en las leyes. Y entonces, como comunidades indígenas, no tenemos ese derecho, pese a que en nuestro territorio tenemos el aire, están las tierras y están instaladas todas estas empresas, ¿no? Entonces, para las comunidades indígenas no existe el derecho, no lo podemos hacer. Podemos hacer solamente en pequeña escala, o sea, esos pequeños proyectos tal vez en pequeña escala que sean cerrados, quizás que sean cerrados y que nada más se ocupen en la comunidad de 0.5 kilowatts o cosas así, pero poder hacer un proyecto más grande para subir a la red, eso no hay un derecho constitucional para nosotros, ¿no? Entonces yo no sé qué es lo que haya pasado allá, si fue el tema ese tema o en la cuestión de los pueblos indígenas, pues es que es diferente. La posesión de la tierra la tenemos los pueblos, pues los pueblos, la mayoría de los pueblos acá somos pueblos indígenas, y el tema es que el tema de la posesión, de la forma de la posesión es lo que son diferentes, o es ejidal, o es privada, o es comunal, pero la mayor parte en el istmo es comunal, o sea, es una tierra imprescriptible, inembargable, sí, o sea, que no se puede vender, no se puede embargar, no se puede, inalienable, ¿no? Entonces, esos son los elementos de la tierra. Gracias.
Pero Bettina, también hay ejidos que no son indígenas, sino campesinos, ¿no es así? Que son resultado de la revolución del 17, ¿o no?
Sí, de 1910, de la revolución. Ajá, o sea, son campesinos, sí son campesinos, la mayoría son campesinos indígenas, ¿no? O sea, pero sin embargo, por toda esta política de homogeneización en nuestro país, pues muchos dicen que no son indígenas, y porque los indígenas somos los que estábamos más abajo, entonces ¿quién quiere ser indígena, no? Somos los más pobres, los más marginados, a los que les pueden robar la tierra, a los que no vamos a la escuela, a los que no, o sea, entonces hay toda una política de desindianeidad en México, ¿no? Una política de blanqueamiento, y entonces por eso el país intentó, el Estado ha intentado consolidar una nación mestiza, para decir, bueno, el mestizo es un poco más blanco, ya no es indígena, ya no es aquel, ¿no? Pero bueno, nosotros, la mayor parte del pueblo mexicano es pueblo indígena, y somos 68 pueblos aún, han desaparecido algunos, pero somos aún 68 pueblos vivos, con territorios, con identidad, con nuestras costumbres y orgullosos de lo que somos, ¿no?
Excelente, muchísimas gracias. Estamos pasados del tiempo. Yo quisiera darle a Ángela o a alguien de la organización del Kleinman Center, perhaps, the last word. If not, I'll ask for like 1 minute wrap up from each of you. So, your wrapping message for the audience. Ganur, I'd like to start with you.
My 1 minute wrap up would be that the energy transition is going to require a lot of land. Indigenous peoples across the world are familiar with land being taken from us. In Australia, it was pastoralism, and then it was mining, And now we're on the crest. We're about to get to the crest of a new wave of land use. This time things need to be different, and there are reasons to be hopeful. We're in a different political environment. Indigenous rights are much more advanced and well recognised than they have been in the past. And the mission of the renewable energy transition is about saving the world and respecting our environment. So there are reasons to be optimistic, but as we've been discussing today, there are also reasons to take caution, and there's no guarantee that this transition will be just without Indigenous people and our allies fighting very hard to protect ourselves and our cultures.
Thank you. Departing minutes, Bettina, un breve mensaje de despedida.
Bueno, solo quiero decir que efectivamente se está hablando de transición energética en México. La transición energética no incorpora ni siquiera la opinión de los pueblos indígenas, ¿no? Eso es uno. Y dos, también quisiera enfatizar que el 80% de los territorios a nivel mundial, que ya lo dije, mejores conservados, están en manos de los territorios, de los pueblos indígenas, ¿no? Entonces, eso es algo muy importante. Y hay otra cosa, que no solamente se tiene que estar pensando, porque esta economía capitalista de despojo nos está llevando, y de consumo, nos está llevando a eso. Hay otras formas de poder mitigar el calentamiento global, porque también los pueblos que más van a sufrir esto somos nosotros mismos, los pueblos indígenas, los pueblos que están en las islas, por ejemplo, más pequeñas y que se están ya inundando, ¿no? Entonces, yo creo que hay otras formas. No se tiene que llegar, se tiene que parar esa carrera de consumo, esa carrera de producción de tantas cosas que se tienen que tener para la satisfacción de la vida. Ese tipo de desarrollo es el que nos ha llevado a esta debacle. Entonces, eso es lo que también se tiene que cambiar. Tiene que haber un cambio en nuestro pensamiento, ¿no?
Gracias, Bettina. Melina, you have the last word, and then we really need to say goodbye.
Thank you so much, and so much respect for the two other speakers that have spoken on this panel with me and their lifelong work. I just wanted to put in the chat here, I think as folks that want to work and support Indigenous communities, please follow Indigenous organizations that are putting out these types of understandings, messaging from, decolonizing climate policy to implementation, and what does a just transition look like? What does climate financing, climate financing look like? So please, I just put these links in the chat because very limited time, but follow these organizations that are really thinking about these questions as community members, Indigenous peoples, and have thought about it for a long time. So I just invite people to kind of learn, continue that journey of learning. Thank you.
Without further ado, we are past our time. Thank you so much for the Kleinman Center for organizing this amazing panel. Thank you to my Center for Latin American Latinx Studies for co-organizing. And thank you, very, very big thank you to the speakers for extremely engaging presentations and inspiring. Best of luck to everybody. Bye now.
Thank you.
Thank you.